When we hear the words Hellsing and villain together, our minds go directly towards the Major. Some of you might think of Father Alexander Anderson, but we'd argue he's more character foil than outright villain. Others might think of the Valentine brothers, specifically Jan for his unhinged personality. But the one that often flies under the radar is also the only true vampire nemesis that Alucard faces across both anime adaptations. Before it became the name of the browser you're all afraid to admit you use, Hellsing fans knew Incognito as the only other real undead in the entire franchise, and a maniacal bastard at that. His insanity in battle is perhaps only matched by Alucard himself, and you will not believe where he supposedly comes from. So, without further ado, let's answer the question we posed in our video title. This is Incognito's Origins Explored. Freak chips and exposés. Hellsing 2001's Vampire Problem. If you guys have seen the Hellsing shows or watched any of our videos on it, especially the 10 biggest differences one, which you should check out if you haven't, you will know that Hellsing 2001 and Hellsing Ultimate are two very different beasts. The latter, while more faithful to the source material, feels like a vampire slasher flick, or more like 10 vampire slasher flicks packaged together in an OVA series. The former feels more like a detective thriller with vampirism at its focus, and a big reason for that are these silicone implants called freak chips. The first episode of Hellsing 2001 is entirely dedicated to the conversion of Ceres Victoria into a Draculina, and the Cheddar Priest's vampirism is never quite explained by series creator Kota Hirano anyway, so we don't want to address that. What we want to address is the opening sequence of the episode where Alucard cleans up a vampire working woman who was looking to seduce and murder, or worse, convert into a ghoul, one of Britain's major politicians. Episode 2 opens with Ceres failing her first mission, but her target is more relevant to this section. The episode shows Ceres being positioned as a sniper with orders to take out a rogue vampire that had appeared in public. This particular vampire, unlike Ceres or Alucard, seemed completely feral, as she was feeding on someone when we first saw her, and she immediately leapt at Channel 10 reporter Kim Chapman when she came across the grisly scene. Though Ceres' squad mate Gareth was able to get the job done in the end, this did raise the question, who in the world was letting these degenerate vampires loose into the world? Alucard's opinion is mostly to be taken with a fistful of salt because he speaks from the perspective of an immortal, but when it comes to vampires, he is the genuine article. So when he notices that these recent vampire attacks are completely unlike those that a true vampire would commit, that is supposed to be our first hint that something more than just paranormal activity is at play here. In that same episode, we come across a vampire couple, Leaf and Jessica, and we learn that these recent menaces that are cropping up in society aren't exactly made the right way. They're all artificially created. Leaf and Jessica were clearly degenerates who got off on killing innocent people, and sadly, we do mean that literally. But just as they are getting off, Leaf says that the rush they get from their current state is unlike any drug they've ever tried before. They speak of vampirism like it's a drug, and that's because it kind of is. Episode 3 opens with yet another disturbing scene where an artificial vampire tries to turn his partner into one as well, but ends up being hunted down for what he was instead. His autopsy reveals that the reason behind the recent rabid vampire's existence was something called a freak chip. This silicone implant had dozens of wires stemming out of it, and it was usually implanted within a person's neck. Once it had taken hold over the person, it transformed them into artificial vampires who possessed pretty much the same powers as the genuine package, just on a lower level in terms of power scaling. Someone had been going around offering these freak chips to Britain's less than gentlemanly underbelly in exchange for the kick of their lives. And this was what Alucard's true investigation in Hellsing 2001 was all about. The discovery of the freak chips coincided with an information breach that ended up exposing Hellsing's existence to the larger British populace. And then, the Valentine brothers attacked Hellsing Manor and decimated their ranks, leaving it at less than a quarter of its full strength. In the aftermath of their attack, as the Hellsing organization was recovering and recruiting to fill up their ranks again, an entity arrived in England whose mere presence was enough to arouse Alucard's bloodlust. Turns out that everything that had happened in the first few episodes, the vampire couple's murder spree, the exchange student's demise, the Flesh investigation, and even the Valentine brothers' assault on Hellsing HQ, it was all a setup. Someone had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes and had finally arrived at ground zero to get his own hands dirty. Alucard calls him a true vampire like himself, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is where we talk about Incognito. An agent of chaos and evil hailing from the Dark Continent, Incognito's attack on Hellsing, and true purpose. Incognito first shows up in Hellsing 2001 at Hellsing Manor itself, which takes Alucard by surprise because he wasn't expecting this. He taunts Incognito by asking him if he'd gotten so hungry that he showed up at Alucard's turf to sate it. Alucard was looking forward to this fight because he and his opponent weren't so different for the first time in a long time. Both of them were true vampires that served human monsters. Both of them used human weapons to fight their inhuman enemies. Even their names were pretty much the same. Alucard comments that Incognito means nobody, and that his own name is an anagram, so such things are ultimately meaningless. He's more excited for the fight, especially when he sees that Incognito uses some kind of special loadout as well, but this is when Incognito speaks unprompted for the first time. He rejects Alucard's claim that they were the same kind of people because one small detail: he was about to make Alucard masterless. See, while Incognito kept Alucard occupied, he sent his Bouban Sith ally Laura to invade Hellsing Manor and get close enough to Integra to be able to drink her blood. Laura, of course, is a name referring to the protagonist of the 1872 vampire novella Carmilla, which actually predates Bram Stoker's Dracula by a quarter of a century. Turns out, Incognito wasn't a nobody with no brains. He'd premeditated everything that had happened up until this point, so it's no surprise that his reveal would also include a lethal distraction. As soon as Alucard realizes the implication of Incognito's words, he is shot by the latter's grenade launcher, which sends a special projectile towards him, and he's forced to release level 1 in response. Before Alucard can bury every bullet in his jackal in Incognito's skull, he teleports to Integra's location and saves her from being turned into a ghoul by shooting Laura dead. But the damage had already been done. Integra was forced to stab herself in the neck to purge the unclean blood from her body, and also required highly risky surgery in the aftermath to ensure her survival. Even in the original story, no one had quite managed to get Hellsing's leader in such a shocking manner, which already solidifies Incognito as one of the most cerebral villains in the whole franchise. But he's also one of the most terrifying villains as well, because Incognito seems to have a single-minded obsession with destroying everything in London, particularly Alucard. After Hellsing is done recruiting enough new members to go on with business as usual, they're immediately called to Bouban Castle, where there's been a reported surge in vampire activity. Of course, we know that Incognito is using this joint as his base from episode 8, because this is where he turns Paul Wilson into his personal werewolf freak by implanting multiple freak chips into his body. Hellsing shows up just in time to clear off the menace, or die trying, but they're bafflingly called away because someone called in a second tip claiming Bouban Castle was the site of IRA activity, which gave jurisdiction over the operation to the SAS. Hellsing withdrew from the scene with grim hesitation because they knew something was wrong here, and they were right. Every SAS troop that entered Bouban Castle never returned, because they were all turned into ghouls by Incognito for his little ghoul army in a rather disturbing cryonic ritual, might we add. Incognito then attacks the only other known true vampire in Hellsing 2001, Helena, and devours her in order to eliminate an obstacle from his path. He intimidates Ceres and claims he will eat her too, but Helena manages to somehow partially break out of his body before being beheaded by him. Incognito laughs like a maniac and leaves the scene, claiming he was only born to destroy everything, and we see the true meaning of his words when the brilliant Sir Integra Hellsing is outplayed once again. See, after everything that had transpired because of Incognito's actions, a meeting between Integra and the Queen had been arranged. The Tower of London was declared as the Queen's traveling destination for public relations, but in truth, the meeting was to take place at Hellsing Manor. All the arrangements had been made, and Integra was just waiting for the Queen to arrive, but she never did. That's because at that moment, ghouls dressed in SAS uniforms started attacking the Hellsing forces gathered at the tower, and everything descended into chaos. News channels picked up the carnage like wildfire, and Hellsing was branded a terrorist organization on national television for some reason. In amongst all this chaos, Incognito waited for Alucard within the Tower of London for their final battle, where he showed that he was far stronger than just a regular vampire. See, Incognito, for some reason, is the only person in the Hellsing franchise who actually uses magic as part of his arsenal, and it makes him a very unique opponent to try and stand up to. Alucard finds it difficult to do so, and he even ends up losing his first encounter against Incognito, which allows the latter to kidnap Integra and take her away to complete his ultimate plan. See, Incognito is a mad bastard. He treated Helena like nothing more than a meal. He savored the pain that his conflict with Alucard brought him and treated it like pleasure, and when he kidnapped Integra, he threatened to violate and vanquish her entire existence after he was was done using her. And what was he using her for? We're glad you asked, because this is where things just go crazy and pick up so many paces that Hellsing 2001 kinda falls flat on its face. Turns out, the reason Incognito needed Integra was so he could use her as part of a magical ritual to summon a demon god named Set. And yes, we'll get into what you're thinking in just a moment. Once he merges with Set, Incognito claims to have enough power to level London, and starts viewing and treating everyone that isn't him as purely inconsequential. His second fight with Alucard is pretty much one-sided because Incognito whoops our main guy for a good chunk of their screen time together. But then, Alucard breaks out Baskerville, and suddenly the whole dynamic is reversed on its head. Up until this moment, Incognito had felt like what Jan Valentine feels like in the main series, but with actual stakes involved this time around. He was violent, he was menacing, he utterly disregarded everything that wasn't in service of his goal, and gave meticulous attention to everything that was. He was not afraid to commit violent, traumatic sins if it got him closer to feeling and being like a god. And now, he had that too, thanks to Set. Incognito was sure that nothing could stop him anymore. He could phase part of his head out of existence and send the bullets back to where they came from before he even got the power up. So how could Alucard ever hope to stop him? Well, turns out he just has to steal the friggin' demon out of Incognito's soul. During a fierce collision and fist/firearm exchange, Incognito ends up blowing apart Alucard's jackal, but Alucard takes away the source of his power, using it to pour melting silver into Jackal's empty chamber. Realizing what had just happened, Incognito immediately pisses himself and starts asking Alucard who he really was. Lightning flashes, and we get a brief glimpse of Alucard's true identity as Vlad the Impaler before he goes ahead and does what he used to be famous for back in the day. The next morning, the sun shines above the cathedral Alucard and Incognito fought at, and revealed the latter's naked body hanging impaled from mouth to bowel with a silver spear. This brings the curtain down on Incognito and Hellsing 2001, which ends with 2 title cards, one of which is important to this video. It is revealed that there was a traitor in Hellsing who was responsible for the Tower of London attack and also for the leaking of Hellsing's existence to the world. This person had apparently been arrested and dealt with by the British government in the aftermath of the Tower of London attack. But why is an unnamed traitor important to the only actual vampire Alucard ever cleans up? Because, at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, it's all connected, man. The man on the inside who pulled all the strings. Who was Incognito's true master, and how is Africa involved? Well, Incognito himself is supposed to be more or less a parallel to the Major from the main series. They do share the same love for total destruction after all. The big difference between the two is that Incognito is a servant of chaos, and the Major was an instigator. In his very first appearance, Incognito taunts Alucard by telling him they were different because Alucard was about to lose his master altogether. This is the first and only overt reference to the fact that Incognito was being controlled by someone. This topic doesn't come up again in the main narrative of Hellsing 2001, but it is continued in the backdrop of everything, and eagle-eyed viewers might have picked up on it as well. It is very likely that Incognito's master was someone from Britain, specifically the Convention of the 12, in fact, because all the evidence points in that direction. First, let's start with Incognito himself. Despite appearing to be a middle-aged white male, there are multiple allusions to the fact that he was from Africa. The first comes when Alucard calls his spine-like grenade launcher cartridges the curse of the Dark Continent. Is it racist to immediately equate that with Africa? Maybe, but the Dark Continent is one of the literary descriptions of Africa that was quite popular before the 21st or even the second half of the 20th century. And Alucard is supposed to be hundreds of years old, so we'll let this one slide. What makes the connection between Incognito and Africa evident is actually not what Alucard says, but what Incognito does after this. Incognito's regular appearance is rather disconcerting. His head is shaped like the crystal skulls from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and a third eye is tattooed across his forehead. Incognito is a bit of a piercing freak because he's got those bastards all over his shop, including one in the center of his third eye. His actual left eye is horribly red and horribly wide open, and it also appears to be connected to his sorceress powers, which is where the African connection becomes overt. Hellsing is no stranger to restriction systems. If you've seen our video on Alucard's anatomy, you'll know that he has a control art restriction system that limits his full power at all times, unless specifically released in extreme cases. It appears that Incognito Incognito's left eye does the same thing for him, because when he activates it, his powers increase drastically. His body starts getting covered by purple markings, and the ones that appear across his face are of particular importance to this video. Incognito's released form gives his face a design that looks like a cross between two Egyptian symbols, the Ankh and the Eye of Horus. The former is a symbol of eternal life, and the latter is usually interpreted as a symbol of protection and rejuvenation. The Ankh can be a signifier of Incognito's eternal life as a true undead, but it's the eye that is more interesting to us, or confusing rather, because in the Osiris myth, the most important myth in Egyptian mythology, Set is portrayed as a usurper and a betrayer. He kills Osiris and wars against Horus multiple times, and on one occasion, Set is said to have taken Horus's eyes. Horus restored them with the help of another god according to various versions of the myth, Thoth in most, and that is why his eye is said to be a symbol of protection and rejuvenation. Incognito, on the other hand, used a demonic ritual with Integra as his sacrifice, so that he could summon and combine with Set. We suppose the justification for the eye being a part of his design is that, well, Set took it in myth, and Incognito is Set's vessel, so combine the two and see if it works. And to be fair to Studio Gonzo, work it did. There's also the fact that in his original design, Incognito's third eye was supposed to have more piercings, so that when he activated his powers, the purple markings on his forehead formed into the Illuminati symbol. We all know where that symbol drew its primary inspiration from, so let's move on from the physical and the esoteric and talk about the political, because there is a political aspect to this entire tale we've just spun that can explain who Incognito's true master was. Let's move ahead with the assumption that Incognito's powers at least originated in Egypt. There are tales in West Africa about vampiric creatures like the Obe Ifo, especially among the Ashanti tribe of Ghana. Egypt is on the other side of the desert, and though it doesn't have vampire myths, it does have history with Great Britain, particularly as a colony. Egypt was one of the UK's most important colonies before World War II strategically and economically, so it isn't a stretch of the imagination to think that Britain would still have some sort of lingering political presence in the nation even in 1999. Why is this relevant? Because if you're going to send someone to Africa to train in the dark arts and come back and wreak havoc on England, you'd better have connections out there. And yes, we say send someone to Africa because we think Incognito was English. Well, it is true that there are white-skinned North Africans as well, even in the region of Egypt. It's Incognito's connection with Laura and the fact that he was able to take over Baobin Castle with such ease that makes it an easy deduction for us. Well, that and his coat. Let's not linger on his fashion choices for too long though, we'll be here all day otherwise. Laura, as we've mentioned, is a character in Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, and though the story is set in Styria in modern-day Austria, Laura's family was of English origin. Moreover, a Baobin Sith, which is what she was classified as by Alucard himself, is typically a malevolent seductress-type fairy from the Scottish Highlands, further solidifying the idea that Incognito was at least from the UK, if not England altogether. The ease with which he was able to procure those SAS soldiers under the pretense of an IRA attack was too convenient for us to believe that someone wasn't pulling an inside job here. And then, the narration cards for the final episode outright spell it out for us. Yes, there was a traitor in the British higher-ups who betrayed Hellsing by having them branded as terrorists on national television. Our best guess is that it's someone from the Round Table, because they need to have extensive knowledge of the occult and access to British military outfits as well. When Alexander Anderson and Enrico Maxwell came to England to take custody of Enrico Stivaletti's corpse, they claimed that the freak chips were originating from Britain itself. And guess where the factory where those chips were being manufactured was located? That's right, Hong Kong, another former jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Someone was creating defective copies of Alucard and spreading them all around the world, seemingly in an attempt to displace Hellsing and take over Britain at the same time. Our best guess so far is that this person was most likely Sir Penwood. Remember that Hellsing 2001 was based purely off whatever Hirano had written up until that point, and he hadn't penned Penwood's heroic last stand back then. It's likely that Studio Gonzo looked at the manga and found Penwood suspicious enough to make him go through with all of this. There's also precedent in the series itself, because when the Flesh investigation began, Integra confronted the Round Table over its failure to contain the leak, and her comments were specifically meant for Penwood, who was the information broker of the table. We don't know if this assumption of ours is true outright, because we're never actually shown the traitor being discovered and dealt with in Hellsing 2001, we just get title cards telling us what had happened. But if our assumption is correct, then it would make everything Incognito and his cronies did make a lot more sense. Penwood just gets the hit from us because, to our minds, he's the most suspicious of the entire lot of 12. Marvelous verdict. But as for this video, we're afraid that this is gonna have to be it. Out of every person Alucard has ever gone up against, Incognito is certainly the most unique of the whole lot. He was powerful enough to inflict more damage on Ceres Victoria than a holy bayonet, yet at the same time, he insisted that he himself was no one, just an agent for destruction and nothing else. As a purely maniacal character with no real backstory or narrative purpose being given to his actions besides "his bad will kill," Incognito sounds shallow on the surface. But his sadism and insanity are captured so well by the animators of Studio Gonzo that he does a full 180 and makes his caricature-esque existence actually feel terrifying. But that's just our opinion on Incognito. What's yours? Let us know in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one.